Hello, hello, friends. Thank you for tuning into the Odd Thoughts podcast. My name is Gunther, and I'm your host, and welcome to episode 14. At the Odd Thoughts podcast, we like to think about and talk about the everyday odd thoughts, as well as discuss some general mental health topics and just have relatable conversations. So, if that's your type of podcast, then I appreciate you tuning in. For today's episode, episode 14, I wanted to talk a little bit about a kind of a broader kind of topic, but more so just trying to get into some questions about it. I just wanted to talk a little bit about being emotional or emotional distress, kind of. You know, the different whims of all of it, the different questions that come with it. You know, why someone's emotional and if it's an unchanneled response, and if someone's more internal or external with how they respond or how they react, as well as, finding those outlets and inevitably trying to relieve yourself of those feelings and in forgiveness as well. So I just wanted to ask some questions about that. So if you want to listen to that, then I appreciate you tuning in. But before we get into that, I just wanted to ask, how's everybody doing? I hope everybody's doing okay. I know I'm doing okay. I make sure that every day I'm just trying to show up for myself. That's kind of something I try to tell myself every day, and it's something I try to do. It's a little more easier said than done, but just make sure y'all are showing up for yourselves as well, and be excellent to yourselves and be excellent to each other. It's kind of wow, But yeah, just be excellent to yourself and just make sure that you show up for yourself every day. But yeah, being emotional, emotional distress. It's kind of a broad topic. Honestly, it really is. Just it's there's so many different little questions that come with it, and just to ask, why I'm emotional or what kind of distress, this emotion brings to me. It's a little tough to just say that. There are, like I said, there's a lot of whims that come with emotion, and a lot of times you don't know when emotion will come on, and you don't know necessarily when, how you'll respond and if it's a proper response, whatever proper means. So yeah, there's just some, especially when it comes from person to person, it feels like that everybody deals with it a little differently. So just to ask, why you're emotional, and it's difficult to just ask that, and to know why you're distressed about something or what causes emotional distress, that's too complicated. Just say one thing. You may have like a list of things, honestly, right? Like, especially when you're reacting in a moment, when you're kind of reacting emotionally to one specific thing, or maybe, a few things that kind of pile up or whatever. But to say that there's one specific, thing, or to say that this is what's proper for whatever, it's just difficult to say that. And as well as to think that, like, also, it's a weird thing to say, that to have like an awareness of being emotional. I know that I'm someone that I know I'm emotional, and I have my little intricacies. Whatever I try to say, I'm trying to use that word, but I have my little, aspects, and I get emotional about certain things. But and I know that I'm aware that I can become emotional towards things, but I try my best not to just walk around and like on tippy toes, basically, right? Like, I want to be aware and be conscious of maybe that I can become emotional, but I never want to just be predisposed that I'm going to become emotional. I never want to always think dreadfully. If I keep thinking kind of how I'm going to negatively respond and negatively feel, then I think I'm always going to feel negative, and I won't ever naturally respond to anything properly, and I probably won't do my best to process emotion properly. So it's best not to just sit there and always think that you're going to react. It's more so just being aware and accepting that you are an emotional person, and like I said, the little whims that come with it. That's, like I said, really kind of a big question. And reactiveness isn't always equated to, like, when you react to something, it's not always equated to what the situation is. That's also a thing too, is at one time maybe a certain situation is not that stressful to you, or doesn't initiate a certain response. But then, because of yada 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 or just whatever, you feel a little more intense about it, and you become a little bit more emotional about it. So that kind of even leads to another question of it being unchanneled. Kind of, when does it, when does emotion become unchanneled? Is if it ever is unchanneled. I know that sometimes, like I said, you can't necessarily differentiate what specific emotion is going to come through. you kind of feel like a wave of something. Something kind of pushes this force onto you, and then you respond with however. And you don't know, like I said, you don't know how it always is going to be. So often it's unchanneled to something or into another emotion. Sometimes I feel like I get so angry that like I like get sad and I get like emotional. I get cry. You know what I'm saying? Or when you get happy, you cry or something like that. Or you could be sad about something, but you're angry that you're sad or something. Like it's such a flux of things. So you never really know when you get that wave of emotion how what it's going to be directly channeled towards. And also when you don't necessarily know the process of things, then you don't know how to channel it to an emotion. When you don't know the questions, and you don't like it's there's never a specific outline for things. So to say that this is how you work through a certain emotion, or this is the best way to channel a process, is hard to say. It's kind of it's not right. It's just, there's no existing outline. Every person's a little different. So that's kind of to say unchanneled is such a big question too, because emotion, or like I said already, emotion's already a big flux of things. It's a wave of things. So to unchannel, it's even to have that is like such a basic, it's such a broad phrase, just like the whole being emotional concept. But emotional maturity is even kind of a big question too, and this, you meet people and you may be that person that is kind of an emotional mature person, but with everything, that's kind of something that I always ask is I can try to be good with certain emotions and certain feelings, but I know that I'm not going to be great with every single feeling and every single emotion. I know a lot of times that like a lot of those will go unchecked, and so emotional maturity is kind of a it's in itself is kind of it's like a big elliptical graph or whatever. I don't know how to. I tried to be fancy with my words. I'm sorry, but emotional maturity it's not even like a real concept. It is a concept, but it's kind of it's hard to be mature all the time. It's hard to be keen on every single emotion that you feel. It's hard to always know when something's going to come on and what's going to cause that distress. And so to be always on point is hard to say. And sometimes things can just build up. And even when you are someone that properly maybe has like a certain proper response or whatever that may mean, it's, it may not always come through. And sometimes the path to that processing that end goal of relieving yourself of distress is long and it can become wavy. And so you never know. You never really, maturity is I don't think is achieved completely. Yeah. And because like I said, sometimes you see people that can contain emotion a little bit better than others. Sometimes you see people that can process emotion a little bit other better than others. But also I bet those people feel sometimes on themselves that why do I feel like I can handle certain things so well, and then the other times I can't, right? Or what happened when I had done something happened to me before, and it's the same thing now, but I don't know how to handle it. That's a big thing. I think some people are good at containing certain emotions or containing a distressful situation. Excuse me, I keep like kind of hiccuping, but that's I've seen it. I think at times I have tried to be my best in it too, and I think sometimes like when something becomes a little more tense, I try to do my best to really channel in a kind of contained kind of demeanor towards something emotional when I become emotional, because it's hard to put that out onto people too, as you don't want to always reflect onto other people. People understand, I think, generally when emotion happens and when someone is emotional, but it's hard to like accept that, like putting that out onto people, and it's hard to accept that, and it happens sometimes, and people are only human, so that can mess with people too, and maybe take away with the idea that you, like I said, that you believe that you're maybe a little bit more emotional mature, more emotionally mature, but then when then you lose that kind of, you lose a sense of direction, or you freak out a little bit and you become stressed out, then you don't let that take away from the work that you have done, and the times that you have been able to work through emotional stress and stuff like that. Yeah, it's just being aware is that I try. It's so tough to just say that too, because I'm aware of me being emotional and the times I've been emotional, but I don't ever want to like walk around and think that I can become emotional. You don't ever want to really walk around thinking that. And also, there's with people like I said, people are different, right? So from person to person, it's never going to be the same on how people react or respond to emotion. And there's no, like I said, no outline. So, and there's really no timeline on how to figure things out. So processing is going to look different for everybody. But I think of an idea of whether when people are more responsive and more reactive to emotion as well, kind of beyond just like the having that emotion and it coming through and beyond just the unchanneledness of it or whatever, but responsive and reactive. I think there is a kind of a slight difference between the two, even though it's a little nitpicky and they run a fine line together. But it's more the idea that honestly that when you respond to something, when you're more responding, you're kind of taking in what is happening and you're trying to process it through a variety of whatever information you have. And not everybody has like the perfect amount of information, like I said. So, but the idea that you're taking in something and really trying to accumulate a proper response, not a perfect response, because perfect is a hard goal to aim for. And I don't know if that's a realistic goal, but something to quelch that the stress. You know what I'm saying? So when you're responding to something, it's more so actually trying to take in things and trying to channel then that emotion. But then you have the adverse, the opposing, which is more being reactive, which is something that I know that I kind of fall around that line of is being a little more reactive. I think sometimes reactivity kind of falls into the line of like of an innate emotion coming through or innate action coming through. Something kind of happens onto you, and then you're just reacting because that's something that just already has been predisposed, and that can come through in a lot of ways. Sometimes things just come in so intense for you, and so you just react to it. And or it's something that you never processed before it or have never known the questions to ask. So you react innately to it. And so, like I said, it's really nitpicky sometimes to kind of even balance between those two questions, to balance between the two, because in the intensity and the shifting of weights of a situation, you're going to probably be able to maybe process some things better and respond, or you're going to innately react to something. You're just going to, it's just going to come out, and it's going to be, like I said, sometimes the waves, you don't know how intense it's going to be at moments. So when it hits, when that wave of emotion hits, you don't know necessarily how it's going to be. You don't know if you're going to be a little more responsive or a little more reactive. And I think there's an intricateness to it. A little bit of like, you got to be able to kind of do both, right? You got to be able to sometimes be able to do both, I guess is a little hard. That's weird to say. I just don't know how to phrase it necessarily. But, the idea that you want to be able to always properly respond to something, but the way if you're always kind of processing and you're always asking questions, that may lead to always walking around thinking that you're going to react to things and avoiding that makes you avoid things, and that's not how you want avoid situations and whatever else. So you don't want to be that way. And then so reactive kind of puts you in a certain situation, and very much so brings an emotion to the forefront. But then it may lengthen that path to processing to an end goal, to that relief. You know what I'm saying? So that's like I said, that it's a little nitpicky, but yeah, but yeah, but anyways, with responding and reacting too comes the idea of well, when you're responding, it's more internal, and kind of when you're reacting, it's more external. And I think a lot of people respond differently emotionally with kind of internal conflict or external conflict, and sometimes both of them reflect each other a little bit, but when people sometimes, like I said, there's so difference and flux between people that people are going to react in their own intricate ways, their own different ways, and you're not always going to be maybe a necessarily internal person or an external person, but when people tend to be more external, it hopefully is never with a malicious thought, right? I think when people are truly in emotional distress, when it's truly something that they didn't plan for or they didn't work themselves into, which, why would you want to work yourself into being emotional? Sometimes it happens, but it's one of those things where you don't ever want to be malicious onto other people, right? Like sometimes you just you're rigid in how you respond to people, and you're a little more aggressive in the help that's being brought to you, and sometimes it affects the things that you love, or like with hobbies and the people that you love, and maybe even work on a bigger scale when it comes to that. So but it always starts with that inner conflict. It's definitely a direct representation of what you're feeling on the inside, but it needed an outlet. Sometimes the questions get so jumbled up when you're inside that it inevitably something's going to explode outwards and it's going to boil over. And so an external response, like I said, it's never to maybe never directly at someone. Sometimes, unfortunately, it may be, but sometimes it's just the person that was standing in front of you, right? Like, or someone that was sitting right next to you. Is never meant to be right at that person, but they were kind of in the balm of emotion. And so when the external happens, unfortunately, it is going to kind of affect this outer life, and you're not going to help the inner with how you react outside. And goes for the other side of things, the adverse side of things is some people are more internal with their actions, right? And when you have someone who's more internal towards a response or how they react, it comes in the form of self-hatred and maybe even self-harm, which is a tough topic to talk about for sure. But when people try to keep it inside, and you try to think that you're going to formulate something, that you're doing your best to keep it inside and not affect other people, but when you don't know the questions, and when you don't have your own personal outline of things, and you don't have the ideas, then you don't know how you're going to you don't know how you're going to work through it, whatever, you know what I'm saying? So internally, then you start to affect yourself. You start talking negatively to yourself, and you start thinking that innately, that because you're responsive to something, or you're emotional towards something, or reactive towards something, that that's just how you should be, or that's how everything is. And then how you're treated should be reflected in that way, which it shouldn't be. Nobody deserves to be mistreated, and you definitely don't deserve to be mistreated. So, when it becomes to that, being emotional and having emotional distress, and that conflict of internal and external, and even like I said, the crossing between the two, how they kind of reflect each other at times. It shouldn't it reflect you as a whole. And when you respond, when it's in a certain moment, if it's more external or more internal, that's not going to necessarily be a tell all of how you're how the future is going to go, how you're gonna be with future emotions. And when you become emotional, which it's a big thing, is emotional is not even just one big event. It's not just like, oh, I'm emotional, oh, this is when it happens, this is the moment. It's emotions comes with so many different little intricateness. I keep trying to use that word, but it comes with its own little whims. It just comes with so many different like variations and aspects, and whether things kind of when things on externally affect you, or the inner thoughts kind of affect you. So that's even this thing, is it's so it crosses over a lot. And a big thing too, and I try to stress this a lot, and something that I've kind of learned, and something that my dad taught me a lot, is when you start to ask the question of, really, was it worth it or whatever. And more so when you start to realize maybe the intensity of the weight of the situation, and how it can affect your response, and how you react, and how you take it out on yourself, or how you might accidentally take it out on others. So, and sometimes when something comes on, when a distressful moment comes on, and you kind of have this high peak of emotion, there's definitely it feels in the moment it's going to be super intense, no doubt. Sometimes some things may not be that intense, and you may not react a certain way to it, and it may not feel very real or whatever to you, but sometimes it's like it's a lot. I know that I think I'd have a tendency to I feel very strongly. I'm very cathartic in how I feel. So I feel very intense when emotions come through. It's very intense for me. And that's with everything, not just a negative emotion, with like, which I'm kind of getting towards in this podcast. But in the positive stuff is sometimes like I can get overly happy sometimes, and that's good, but sometimes it can hurt as well. Just like with anything, it's that intensity, it hurts, and that puts you through a suffering, and sometimes will kind of blanket or blind maybe what the actual weight of the situation is, the actual significance of the situation. Because undoubtedly there are things that are going to be real and are going to affect you directly, and they are going to be real negative things, and not just be negative in how you respond to it, right? But negative in actual situation, and can be a really real, negative thing. So sometimes when the weight of the situation gets lost in your intensity, you could be super blasé about something that's got a lot of weight to it, that's something that's kind of serious, and the fact that it's you're not really reacting to it doesn't maybe will hurt you in the way forward. Maybe not, though. Also, that's a hopeful thing, is to think that maybe you could just avoid it, and that kind of works too. It's like I said, from person to person, it's hard to put that outline and say that this is what works. But yeah, but even and then if you're in like a high intensity moment and you just kind of reacting to something, or you feel very strongly about something, maybe it's really not that serious. Maybe what you're reacting to really has no significance. And I don't ever want to use as like significance as like a belittling thing where it's saying like, oh, what your problems are insignificant, which is just stupid to say. Everybody's got problems, and everybody responds differently, and everybody processes differently. So you learn that that people's problems are very real to them. So to talk about how significant it is very individual to whoever it is. So people are going to process it differently. I think intensity, and sometimes when you feel a lot of weight in a certain situation, it's a pretty big factor when it comes to processing. It's especially like that big first initiator of like a blockage, if anything. If you're working towards trying to ask the right questions and trying to relieve yourself of this distress, then you realize that intensity is gonna have to be realized, and the weight of the situation is gonna be realized. And when things kind of hit you really hard, it may lengthen that path, whatever that path may be to you as a person, to you as an individual. So after you get past, I think, kind of when the intensity maybe dies out, or you kind of really do kind of accept the weight of a situation, then that maybe leads to processing becoming a little easier. The processing of getting towards a relieving yourself of emotional distress or being emotional. And different people just respond, right? And I try to be so significant on that, and that's what I love about talking about these topics, is that people are different, right? It's more so about asking questions, and you'll find your answers, and you'll find different subset of questions to ask under one big question. So, and it's all about opening that conversation up. Right. And then as you start to process, and hopefully when the questions start to pop up, and maybe you start to figure things out about yourself, you start to realize that the ultimate goal is relief, right? The ultimate goal is that you want to take yourself away from that emotion, and you want to take yourself out of a distressful situation, and you want to find some sort of relief. And relieving yourself comes in many forms of outlets, many different forms of things. I think a big thing, and I think a thing that's kind of common, is having a good internal dialogue. I know that a lot of times that I don't have a lot of people around me that I talk to, or that I feel confident in speaking my truths and speaking what I feel. So I try to have my as best of an internal dialogue as possible. And it's not always great, but the fact that I'm talking to myself, and at times even letting it out loud and speaking it into the ether. Sorry, excuse me. But speaking into the ether, I'm just trying to hear the words. You know what I'm saying? I'm trying to speak out these questions, and for some reason, I think when I kind of put it into the real world, it helps me process a little differently. And hopefully that when I'm asking questions, and I keep myself open to thinking about these moments, and thinking about being emotional, and thinking about stuff like that I'm opening myself up into having maybe even eventually a conversation with others, because there will be people that are out there that will talk to you, or will listen at least. You don't have to have someone that responds to you, and you don't need a therapist necessarily. But and I would suggest, if you want a therapist, to go try it. Go try therapy, but sometimes you just need someone to listen. Sometimes you're asking the right questions, and sometimes you have the right monologue going, and sometimes or dialogue going, and sometimes you just need someone to listen to it. And maybe it feels weird that you keep it inside, and you're internalizing those questions. So maybe for some people, it's automatically more comfortable to just outwardly communicate that. And there will be people that will want to listen, and maybe people that will help, and that can relate, which is kind of a cool thing. Is maybe you can find people that can definitely 100% relate to what you're feeling, and relate to the stress and the emotion that you're feeling, but don't always expect there to also be people. And that is an unfortunate thing, is that there are sometimes people who are just not receptive to that type of thing, and you can't blame them for that. You really cannot say that everybody should be receptive to it, because there's so many different levels to it. Some people can't even deal with their own emotions, so they don't want to hear from others, and you can't blame people for not wanting to listen. And also at times maybe some people think they can listen, and if they do, and they maybe offer a response, or something that's not as pleasurable, or words that are not so encouraging, that you don't take that so seriously. The idea is that you're keeping the conversation open, that you're kind of constantly working through it. I think the questions never die out and the conversation never ends. And so you're constantly having that dialogue. But for some people, and I know for myself, I mean, I can have a really good inner dialogue, but I don't have I have a hard time talking to others. That I also know that sometimes, very really, I need to find outer outlets. I need to have some sort of outside influence that's kind of maybe quelching my insides. I get so, even in the times where I get so jumbled up and I'm not really working forward or progressing through my thoughts, which I think a lot of people can kind of get to that point, is you got to get to a point where the conversation ain't moving. You're not working through anything, or at least it feels like you're not working through anything. So sometimes you just need to remove yourself from the situation, and maybe remove yourself from it in a way of distraction, not forgetting what's going on, and not forgetting what's putting you through that emotion, or that emotion itself, but distracting you and taking you into a different light. So, in a very cliche, sorry, I'm falling over. I had to scratch. Sorry. But in a very real way, you need to find like hobbies and passions and stuff like that. And it's so basic with it. You don't have to get super complicated. It doesn't have to be like, woodworking, even though that's cool. It doesn't have to be art, even though that's cool. It could be just walking, like literally just going outside and changing your routine. I remember one time I was watching an interview with Jim Carrey on the Graham Norton show, and he was talking about when he did The Grinch. He was talking about how the makeup process was so terrible, and it was painful, and he just couldn't do it anymore. So a couple of the producers had an idea that they would hire this guy that used to work for the CIA, who used to train operatives to withstand torture. And so Jim Carrey like learned how to do, like, if he's starting to get too like if stuff is getting too hectic, that you kind of switch your routine a little bit. So that's maybe kind of the idea, is that in his example, it was like punching yourself in the leg and smoking cigarettes. Like, don't do that necessarily, but you kind of want to distract yourself for a moment. You want to take yourself out of that moment. Watch something that you love, and find go outside and walk, and just try and find an outward outlet. And there's so many. It feels like there's a big variety of things, and it's almost nothing is perfect, right? So there's not a perfect response, and no perfect outline, and there's no perfect timeline. So it's going to take brainstorming, and it's going to take a constant conversation with yourself, and that constant dialogue, and constant working through things to realize what will help you relieve yourself, and what will give you kind of that relief. Emotions will always be there, right? It's you there will inevitably be moments when you become emotional. Like I said, to be emotionally mature is kind of a complex thing. So you will react at certain times and respond differently to certain things. So, but I think it's important to keep that conversation open, and that realization that you're going to need some way to relieve yourself, and inevitably, and that's what you want to work towards, is that relief. You want to be able to have that processing of things, and whatever answers come through, and whether it's perfect or not, whatever that may mean to you, you want to constantly just be trying to work towards that relief. And ultimately, when you reach there, and maybe you work yourself out of this certain emotional moment, and then you're not in that big distress anymore. I think sometimes, based off of how you reacted internally, or maybe how you reacted externally, and the negatives, you also got to look at the positives. But sometimes you got to realize that you did your best, right? I often, when I when I work through my emotions, and I get really angry and I get really emotional, that I remember that it was, I tried to do my best. That I'm every day I am trying to do my best, and I'm waking up and I'm showing up for myself every day, and I'm legitimately trying to do what's best for myself. And how I hit my hand, sorry, but it's not going to be perfect, and I'm not going to be able to do maybe everything that I think I know is best for me, especially when, like I said, when the shift of intensity and the weight of the situations are different, right? But I gotta remember that at the end of the day, that if I worked hard, if I worked through things, and I eventually ended towards an end goal, and it may not, like I said, may not be perfect, and I maybe really didn't deal with too much, but I gotta learn to think about forgiving myself, and in asking at the end of the day, unfortunately, was it worth it? That's a big question. Is earlier when I was talking about, like, you often ask, was it worth it to be emotional? And it's a lot easier to ask that once you've kind of worked through the emotions, and when you work through the stressfulness, it's a lot easier to ask, why did I react that way, and could have it been better? Could it have been better? Sorry, that was a tongue tied. What the heck? Why were you upset and stuff like that? Asking those questions, and like I said, keeping the questions going and keeping that constant dialogue with yourself. Forgiveness is a really big thing, especially, you may be, it's hard to forgive yourself. People may tell you, like, oh, it's okay, you got mad, and or you were upset or whatever, you responded a certain way, but it's okay, and I forgive you. And that can be very helpful to hear, truly. Sometimes it's an affirming thing to hear that it is okay, but at the end of the day, you still got to kind of think about forgiving yourself. Yeah, people tell you it's okay, and I'm very guilty of this, is that, if they'll say, "Oh, it's okay, Gunther, like, don't worry about it." But I was like, "Well, I am worried about it because inevitably I'll be going through the same thing." And so, but I got to remember also that I know I'm going to go through the same things. It's part of that being aware of being emotional. It's part of that consciousness, you know what I'm saying? So I know that I'm going to become emotional. So I just make sure I do my best. I make sure that I understand that I got to work towards feeling that relief, and making sure that at the end of the day, that I forgive myself. That I say, "Hey, sorry, Gunther, like, I'm sorry that you had to feel this way, and I'm sorry that we had to put ourselves through whatever, but we did it. We made it on the other side." And I think that's a conversation that everybody can kind of have with themselves. I think that's a big thing, and it can feel very hard to forgive yourself sometimes, and especially when I'm so inquisitive of myself, and I question everything I do sometimes. So, why should I feel forgiveness, and what do I deserve from it? But I think everybody deserves forgiveness a little bit. And that's a big question too. But we're just talking about in these emotional moments. Sometimes they can be big, and I'm not talking about the bigs, the extremes on both sides. We're just talking about the basics, just opening up that questions of that. But yeah, even in, like I said, even in itself, the being emotional, or emotional distress, even in itself, is kind of it's a broad term. And there's so many whims and so many complexities to it. And to say that there is specifically one thing, one outline to work through everything, and to specifically know how you're going to respond every time is too complex, and is not realistic. What is realistic, though, is having a constant conversation with yourself, making sure that you know that times will be tough when you're feeling emotional, that maybe that when you're feeling super intense emotions, that it's not, equivocating to what the actual weight of the situation is, knowing that you're working towards that goal of relieving yourself, and making things better for yourself. So yeah, but it's, like I said, just such a broad topic, and whatever being emotional is. And I really know that I'm an emotional person. I truly am. I quite often, I try my best to keep it internal, but I know that it leads to things like, self perception, and poor self perception, and self hatred and stuff like that. And so I try to find a lot of outlets, and having that inner dialogue with myself helps a lot. I really do realize that. And then when I talk out loud, and especially with the podcast, it kind of helps me. It really, when I get to focus in on these certain topics, it gives me a channel. It makes it so that I don't have to let it out somewhere where it's going to hurt me, especially on my loved ones. I know that I spent a lot of time around my dad, and so I know that sometimes, like, I can't help but, like, react a certain way to him, and he's so good about knowing that, like, or if not, I'm not saying that he's like, I've trained him or anything, like, so I don't want to phrase it like that, but he's so smart, and he understands, and he's empathetic towards me, and he knows that I'm not always responding. I'm really not responding with that hatred and that maliciousness. Never am. But I think that's most people too. Being emotional is okay. Just everybody, it's okay to question it too. To ask yourself why you're emotional, and realize that sometimes that you will be emotional towards something, and it may be kind of unchanneled, and it's very real to question the internal and the external and how you respond to things. But everybody needs to work towards that relief, and eventually work towards that forgiveness of yourself. And yeah, but yeah, that's it. That's all I really wanted to talk about for episode 14. Being emotional, emotional distress, just asking those questions. And like I said, that's something I love to do with this podcast is I just want to open up the conversation and ask questions and just get people talking just like I'm talking, and hopefully maybe you listen to it and you want to go and talk to other people as well, and maybe you want to show someone this podcast and say like, hey, this guy, he's someone that you can listen to. You don't have to pay attention to me like so significantly. I'm here for your relief. I'm here for your entertainment. I'm here for that background noise. I'm here for any support that you need. You know what I'm saying? But yeah, but I appreciate y'all listening. I thank y'all for listening to this podcast. I upload every single episode on either YouTube or I upload it on Spotify podcast. The Odd Thoughts podcast. Pretty simple. You know what I'm saying? If you want to go check me out on other social medias, on Facebook, I go by Gunther Getlicker on Facebook. Both those G's are capitalized. That's my name. I go on Instagram. I'm on Instagram as well. On Instagram, I go by Gunther_Getlicker. Both those G's are lowercase. And then you can follow me on Twitter. I'm at OneMikeGG. Both those G's are uppercase. And I appreciate anybody that like stays tuned in, and I hope that y'all stay tuned in for any future activities. And I just want to let everybody know that I love y'all. I really do. And I just want to let you know that I see you guys, and that you guys are appreciated. And just remember, everybody, be excellent to each other.